Welcome to the Motivate Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are trying to provide Christian motivation one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. Hey, thanks for coming back. My name is Clint Armitage. I'm the host of the Message Motivate Podcast. Super happy you're here again to listen to part 2. So we started a series last time called, it was a 3-part series, and part 1, well, they're all called 3 Intriguing Things That You May Not Know About Jesus. And that, last time was part 1, and we talked about the shepherds that were possibly Levitical shepherds. That was cool. If you want to hear that, if you haven't heard it, go back and listen to that podcast. And this is part 2. And part 2 is going to be not related to his birth like the first one was. This one's going to be related to the death of Jesus and kind of an intriguing thing that you may not know. Now, this one comes specifically from the Bible, so it is actually fact and it's confirmed here in the Bible. So we're going to talk about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from Matthew 27, a few verses in Matthew 27 to talk about this thing related to Jesus' death. And it's about the curtain that was in the temple. Okay, so listen for that as I read through a few of these verses. All right, here we go. We'll start in verse 45 of Matthew 27. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he is calling Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with the wine vinegar, put it on his staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. And when Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of the many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. So we're ending there in verse 53 there. But in verse 51, that's the part I want you to focus on. At that moment, meaning when Jesus died and he gave up his spirit, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And so it's just a little one-liner, right? And you're like, okay, there's earthquakes and all that stuff, and the temple torn, or the curtain in the temple torn in two. Well, there's significance to that. Spiritual significance to go along with the physical occurrence that happened. It happened at the same time. 1, that's totally interesting. But then 2, let's talk about why that happened and the spiritual significance of what God was doing and saying. Okay? So we're going to move on to Exodus chapter 30 here to talk about the high priest back in the Old Testament there and what he had to do, which was Aaron at this time, at the tabernacle. This is when they first built the tabernacle before the temple. This is the moving temple. And when the Israelites were moving about, they had a tabernacle that was basically that could be broken down and moved around as God led them. So Aaron was a high priest at the time. So he had a specific job. So we'll talk about that, and we'll start in verse 7 here. So the high priest's job was this. It says, Aaron must burn fragrant incense on the altar every morning when he tends the lamps. He must burn incense again when he lights the lamps at twilight, so incense will burn regularly before the Lord for the generations to come. Do not offer on this altar any other incense or any burnt offering or grain offering, and do not pour a drink offering on it. Once a year, Aaron shall make an atonement on its horns. This annual atonement must be made with the blood of the atoning sin offering for the generations to come. It is most holy to the Lord. Okay, so we'll stop there in verse 10. So what that's talking about is it's laying out the high priest's job when it came to going into what we'll talk about in a second, but it's the most holy place there. See, it says that the last line says it is most holy to the Lord. This is a very restricted area, and we'll talk about what the high priest's job entails and the restrictions on it, okay? So one of the things you see, it is specific. Okay, God said, I don't want any grain offerings on it. I don't want any other burnt offerings on it. Don't pour drink offering on it. It's not made for that. what it's made for is the atoning sin offering. Okay? So now we're going to find out. It doesn't give you all the details of what the high priest duties were right there, but it gives you a little bit of the layout and what they needed to do. Now I'm going to take us to Hebrews chapter 9, and the writer of Hebrews actually breaks it down, and so it tells you kind of the rooms leading to this place that was the most holy, right? Okay, so we'll start in verse 1 in chapter 9 in Hebrews. Now the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. Tabernacle was set up. In its first room were the lampstand and the table with its consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the atonement cover, but we cannot discuss these things in detail now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry, but only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people that had committed the sins that people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. Okay, so that was the old covenant, and now the author of Hebrews is talking about the new covenant. And basically what that new covenant is what Jesus did. That's the new covenant, including Jesus's sacrifice. Okay, so you're going to see how the significance of that curtain now plays into the death of Jesus. Okay, so back then it was Aaron. Aaron was the high priest. And during when the temple was actually built, they had the same thing. They had the inner room, the outer room, and then the inner room, the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And it was separated by a curtain. And you couldn't go in. Not just anybody. It had to only be the high priest. And back in tabernacle time, it was Aaron. And now, not only that, you could only go in once a year. And you had to bring blood. You couldn't just go in for no reason. You only go in once a year for a specific reason with an atoning sin offering. Okay, that was the only thing that was allowed in. And so what they used to do was they used to tie a rope and bells around the high priest before he went in once a year, because they would listen for the bells. As long as the bells were moving, the high priest was fine. But once there was no noise, they knew the high priest had died in there, because remember, that was God's presence. That was the most holy place. It was sacred. And if something happened and you could die just by facing God in his presence, right? Because he is so holy. So when the bells stopped, they had that rope. So they used to drag. That was the plan, was to drag the high priest out. Didn't make it. So what does it all signify? It signifies that Jesus' body was the curtain. Okay, we couldn't enter the Holy of Holies because we were sinful people. But when Jesus died, he sacrificed himself, and that curtain tore in two. His body was torn for us so that we could approach God without any hindrance. We can go directly to God now. So that's the significance of the veil tearing upon Jesus' death. Jesus allowed us, his sacrifice allowed us to go directly to God. And we don't have to go through others. We don't have to make sacrifices because Jesus did it for us. That is so cool. Anyways, that's part 2. And next time we'll talk about part 3, which is about his occupation. Thanks for joining us. My name is Clint Armitage with the Message Motivate Podcast. Stay safe, stay motivated. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Motivate Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.